I work at a train station that services unusual destinations. Last night, a passenger exploded. Written by NewTownjam. L, is it? That's what my name badge says, I responded flatly to the man in the red bowler hat on the other side of my plexiglass ticket booth. He had been complaining about a cancellation for at least 20 minutes. Well, L, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. Great. My favorite line. I prepared my scripted response. I'm the only staff member on duty at this time. If you have an issue, you can log it with the phone number on the poster. I tapped the glass next to the poster detailing how to contact Connected Railways head office. It was one I'd had to demand after one too many incidents with disgruntled passengers angry at delays, cancellations, and prices. I didn't control that shit, and I was sick of being abused for it. Red bowler hat inhaled sharply for a prolonged period. His face turned so red it reminded me I had some strawberries in my fridge at home that needed using before they went bad. As he took in more air, buttons on his shirt began to detach and ping in all different directions. I was suddenly more grateful than usual for the plexiglass as the little plastic pucks bounced off it. I sighed deeply and hit the red security button underneath my desk as I braced myself for whatever onslaught was to come next. Then he blew up. Not blew up as he ranted and screamed at me like a normal asshole customer in a service-based industry. Nope. Red bowler hat man inhaled so much air he quite literally blew up, spattering blood across the floor of the station entrance, my ticket booth, and any other passenger in a 10-foot radius. Luckily, there was only one who hastily made their way to the platform. I looked on in despair as his hat rocked a little upon impact with the floor. I know I should sound more shocked, frightened even, when I talk about a man exploding before my very eyes. That would be a normal reaction, but incidents like that one were 10 a penny at the station and had become more of an annoyance than a source of terror. In my line of work, a man exploding was relatively normal. Not terribly extraordinary, at least. What a mess. Is everyone okay? Atlas arrived, befuddled as he looked at the pile of scattered organs on the floor. Atlas was the night security guard, one of only 2 other members of staff in the entire station, and my savior from both boredom and the unusual passengers. He had long, dark hair that he pulled into a messy bun on top of his head that always made his hat sit strangely. I think so. Just need to call Nikki and get things cleaned up. Sorry for summoning you. I thought it was going to be much worse than that. The guy looked angry. Never a bother, Elle. You know that. Nikki's gonna love. Alice was cut off by a loud and nauseating slurping noise as the organs and bits of person started to move together across the concrete floor as if they were suddenly magnetized. The blood on my booth congealed into droplets that danced down the screen and towards the collecting mass. The explosion hadn't been entirely out of the ordinary, but this was beginning to pique my interest. Good job you called, Atlas continued, a curious expression on his face as the mass built to a height that towered above us both. Screaming, naked, and covered in a transparent goo, Red Bowler Hat Man was reborn and much bigger and angrier than he had been before. He bent over, picked up the bloodied hat, and placed it on his head before approaching the booth. I wasn't sure on the purpose of the hat. After all, the rest of his clothes remained shredded on the floor. Regardless, I found him quite intimidating and almost wavered through my next scripted response. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave Connected Railways property. Red Bowler Hat foamed at the mouth, revealing a set of yellow teeth, and continued squealing into the open air. I cringed a little and tried to look away, watching the unsuspecting, oblivious person in the street behind him and envying their ignorance. They were only a few feet away, and yet to them, the incident wasn't happening at all. Oh, how sweet it must have been to not see the booth, the blood, or the naked man screaming in the night. That would have been a real treat. The station I work at is only visible to those who are already aware of its existence, or it would have been quite the scene, even at 2 a.m. That's what I've deducted in my time here anyway. I'd walked this street 1,000 times before my interview and never once seen a station entrance. There was no other explanation. My employment as a normal human that stumbled across the advert by pure dumb luck, was more unusual than anything I'd witnessed from Red Bowler Hat Man. I stayed firm, maintaining eye contact as I watched Atlas creep up behind the creature and hold up a pistol. A security guard with a gun wasn't a typical sight in England, even in the city. But then nothing about my workplace was typical. He pulled the trigger, releasing a sharp point and injecting a yellow liquid into the man's neck. I watched as he dropped to the floor, shrinking into the disgruntled passenger he had been prior to the explosion, albeit stark naked. "Where was he headed, El?" Atlas asked, grabbing hold of the now comatose creature and struggling with the dead weight as he tossed him over his shoulder, careful to avoid certain regions. "He was moaning about the cancellation on the village line, Cordyline Hill via Monsoon Valley. I tried explaining that there was only 1:30 minutes after, but he didn't let me. I'll take him down to the platform now. Page the guys at Monsoon Valley. Village line comes in at 2:22 and reaches MV by 2:46. He should stay like this until then. He's their problem now." "Finish," I added, just as he walked away. I sighed. I was grateful for Atlas, but he could be tone deaf at times and was blind to the irony of cutting me off just like Karen in the Red Bowler Hat had. I leaned back in my chair, kept one eye on the large antique clock on the wall to the left, and prepared for the rest of the night to go by uneventfully. I know it seems strange to be so positively apathetic. You have to understand how real desensitization is. The more we consume, the easier it gets, and Bowler Hat wasn't the first and definitely wouldn't be the last monstrous transformation I'd seen. I can't explain the things that go on at the station entirely. I have my theories, but I have no way of confirming or denying them. The only hard fact I have are these. I have never heard of a single station we service. I'm absolutely certain that at least 90% of our passengers aren't of the human variety. Regardless of the risk I run of being eaten, I'm still a paid pittance like every other booth worker in the country, and on any given day, I might have to drive home soaked in blood. So why do I stay? I stay for passengers like the one that followed Red Bowler Hat. I'm not immune to curiosity. I recognize that I'm shafted by Connected Railway on a regular basis with only a poster and a charming but undeniably human security guard for protection. But that doesn't change the fact that when you work with things that are out of this world, every now and again you come across one that makes it somehow worth it. The woman in the floor-length tweed coat was not your run-of-the-mill, angry, potentially explosive customer. She was much more. She approached with a small dog in her arms, her coat sweeping across the hard ground where bits of organ had previously been strewn, walking with such dainty steps it was almost as if she were floating. She wore a scarf that matched the coat and had a face with more wrinkles than necessary to tell a story. I would have put her in her 90s at best, although she was perfectly mobile. "How can I help?" I asked, attempting to put on my best customer service face. "A single to Meander Place, please. No return." Meander Place wasn't a destination I was often asked for tickets to. It sat on the barely used Epstar line, which was mostly used by the more intimidating of passengers. I've never taken any of the trains myself, despite my curiosity, but I tried to take note of the people I saw and where they were going. There was no other visible way to pass the time. "That'll be £29.50, please." "I'm afraid I don't have that. I spent the last of my money in that delightful pub across the street. We're going to have to come up with another method of payment." I held in a sigh. The station sat opposite an unusual, traditional-looking old pub called the Pickled Gnome, which seemed to be a popular stop for my passengers before their journeys. I often questioned the type of patrons that it served, although I suppose I was in no real position to. "I'm sorry, we don't offer payment plans or alternative methods here." "You don't understand, do you?" The woman made eye contact with me, and I felt my head freeze into position, staring back at her. Her eyes were an incredible marbled yellow with flecks of green, and her next words made my skin crawl. "This is a transaction between you and I, not a faceless company you represent, Elfida." My blood ran cold. No one, not my employer, nor even the few people I considered friends, knew my full name. I managed to break my trance-like fixation on the woman to check my badge, and just as I suspected, it said L. "Who are you?" "Interesting. You don't want to know how I know your name. You want to know who I am. You have a habit of asking all the wrong questions, don't you?" "What are you talking about?" "Ha, see again. Another useless question. I suppose as I know your name, it's only fair you know mine. Agnes Copper. Haven't you ever wondered why you're here?" She placed the small, scruffy-looking dog on the floor and extended a frail skeletal hand out towards the booth. Hand shaking, I pressed the security button hard, eliciting a wry smile from Agnes. "That's not going to work, Elfida. I'm glad I have your attention, though. If that weren't the case, you'd have noticed the clock you've been watching for the past few hours stop." She was right. The clock had stopped, and I hadn't noticed. I gulped. I dealt with some incredibly unusual passengers, but none of them had ever rendered my security button useless or known my full name. "What do you want?" The dog barked, making me jump. Agnes shushed him before continuing. "That's a better question, dear, although you already know the answer. I want a ticket to Meander Place. The question is, what do you want?" I took a moment to try and comprehend her question at all. She spoke with a glee that made me deeply uncomfortable. In the short term, I wanted Agnes Cooper gone and to forget about her yellow eyes. I had a feeling that wasn't what she was referring to, however. "Come on, Elfida, there must be something." "Please stop calling me that. My name is Elle," I spoke with a quiet defiance. She smiled, enjoying my agitation. "Oh, am I getting somewhere? Now, why would a pretty girl like you hate a pretty name like that so much?" I felt a pang in my stomach. I hadn't thought about my life with that name for a long time. Life before Irene disappeared. It's personal. "I know, dear. I think you're aware I already know the answer." Her eyes lit up and she licked her puckered, wrinkled lips as I shuddered at her words. "You're wondering now if I know where she is, aren't you?" I was. She was right. Who wouldn't wonder? When my little sister went missing, there wasn't a trace of her left in my parents' home, my old home. She was only 8 years old, and one morning she just wasn't in the house. They never found a stitch of evidence. That was enough to drive my parents to alcoholism, abuse, and eventually divorce. I got it. They lost a kid, but it sure did suck to be the sister left behind in the shitstorm. 10 years old, and I had to roll my mother over to stop her choking on her own vomit. I put up with 8 years of that before I fled, came to university in the city, shortened my name, and never went back home. Of course I wondered where she was. Do you know where she is? Agnes laughed an evil cackle, sinister enough to make every bone in my body vibrate. I felt weak, like all the wind had been knocked straight out of me. I tried to control it, but tears fell against my will. I hadn't thought about Irene in so long. "Oh, are you a gambler, Elfida?" Agnes asked, ignoring my question entirely. "I've never considered myself to be a betting woman," I answered, voice shaking audibly. "Well, I think it's time you start. If you print me a single ticket to Meander Place, I will give you a clue. What a wonderful thing. A little piece of hope. The clue could lead to that little girl you seek, or it might not. After years of no answers, isn't it worth the risk? For the minimal cost of a £29.50 ticket?" "If the clue is useless, what are the consequences?" "A better question. Finally, you've got it. Shame we're almost out of time. My train leaves in a few minutes, and I'm not too quick on my feet. Make a decision, Elfida. I think you know I'm getting on that train either way. I hated arrogant customers. I made a point of ensuring I did my job properly, no matter what crazy things were going down in the station. But Agnes made a compelling case. She may have looked old and frail, but she froze the air in the space around her. I wasn't confident I'd even get close to stopping her aboard that train. How could I let the opportunity to find Irene slip away? I printed the ticket. Of course I did. One way to Meander Place, the Epstar line. Agnes continued to frantically lick her lips as the machine made the printing noise. Her mouth moved like a snake. It terrified me. As I handed it to her through the slot, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny red box, only large enough for small pieces of jewelry, replacing the paper slip with it. Thank you, Elfida. I hope you find what you're looking for. She winked a reptilian yellow eye and shuffled away from the booth towards the platform entrance. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the box, then back at the clock that continued ticking the moment Agnes was out of sight. I searched for her on the platform security cam that faced me inside the booth, but she'd vanished. No trace. Just like Irene. I stroked the box, unsure I even wanted to know what was inside, while simultaneously desperate to see the contents. Monsoon Valley just called. The guy had the same argument with them. Popped all over again. The guard there is having a total crisis. Thank fuck we're rid of that shit, right? Atlas interrupted my deep and brooding thoughts. I shoved the box into my pocket as quickly as I could and looked up, blinking away any residual tears from my interaction with Agnes. Sounds like a blast, I joked, managing a chuckle for Atlas. We'll have to tell Nikki about it when she's done with Platform 9. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and check on her anyway. The Epstar line just blasted through there. Never know what unsavory characters might be about. Atlas spoke seriously, but I struggled to take him so. He always seemed impervious to the strangeness that surrounded us, and my recent meeting had cut through my apathetic disposition. I was relieved when he wandered off, giving me a chance to breathe. After a few moments collecting myself, I finally gathered the strength to reach into my pocket and open the red box. When I saw the contents, I almost flung them and the box at the floor and ran. Inside was a finger. A small severed finger. The nail was painted pink, splotches on the skin around it like it had been painted by a child. It had. I'd painted Irene nails that exact shade the night she went missing, but it didn't make any sense. It had been years, and the finger was so fresh. Even if she was alive, how could she still be so small? Fighting the bile in my throat, I noticed a pattern. Words intricately carved and so minuscule they were a struggle to read. Find me in Thistle Park. There was something watching me play in the garden earlier. I saw it in the trees. Oh, don't be silly. Probably just an animal or something. It wasn't. Don't be a scaredy cat. Tell Mom and Dad if you're worried. Why are you in my room anyway? Leave me alone. That was the last interaction I had with my little sister. Irene didn't protest or even attempt to say another word when I dismissed her. She just skulked off, presumably used to my shitty prepubescent attitude that had blossomed around that time. I was 10 years old and just starting to develop any kind of interest in being cool. My 8-year-old sibling just didn't make the cut, especially not when she still believed in fairy tales. Irene was a creative child, almost to a fault. She was convinced there were fairies, nymphs, and gnomes alive and well, populating the corners of the world that people didn't look in. I thought she was utterly ridiculous, despite secretly wishing I lived in her make-believe world. Now, with the job I have and the things I've witnessed, I deeply regret writing off her stories completely. I had spent a lifetime running from my guilt. I don't know for a fact that she ever spoke to my parents about the Watcher, but I suspected that she did, and that their guilt over ignoring it was what solidified our family's downward spiral. It is a little sick that I resented her. In my mind, Irene got to spend eternity in fairy tale land, never growing up and dealing with reality, while I was left to clean up the drunken mess my parents became. It didn't seem fair when I was a little kid. It didn't seem fair as an adult either. especially not as I sat in my car, severed finger in its box in one hand and return ticket to Thistle Park Station in the other, parked up at my workplace on my day off. I felt quite farcical, following the advice of a strangely knowing old lady, a lady who had outright said that there was potential for the finger to be a dead end, a game. There were a million other things I could have been doing that weren't chasing answers to an impossible question. Either way, I felt a responsibility to the memory of my sister to at least check, regardless of my desperate previous attempts to numb the pain by forgetting all about her. Her being alive would change so much. If Irene was out there, I had to bring her home. I lifted my hood to avoid being seen by any of my coworkers. I didn't work alongside the day crew often, but we intermingled from time to time, and I didn't feel like sharing my deep familial trauma with them. I knew my boarding one of the trains would have caused quite a stir. Skulking past the ticket booth, I noticed Amanda, my daytime counterpart, frantically cleaning the desk. I'd never interacted with her, but I'd always been mightily irritated by the booth smelling of bleach. I complained about it to Atlas near constantly. She was an obsessive cleaner, and I always arrived to an immaculate workstation that I would soon turn into my preferred chaos. It took quite the resolve not to peek in and ask her to stop. I managed, though, the urge continuing onto the platform. Thistle Park was situated on the village line, a few stops beyond Monsoon Valley, but way before Accordion Line Hill, where the train terminated. It brought me some comfort that I wasn't going too far from home. The journey, if it ran according to schedule, should have only taken me 46 minutes. I settled on a bench at the far end of the platform 5, noticing a few familiar-looking youths on bikes by the stairs at the other end, waiting for the same train I was. They were regulars at the station, often passing through late at night, inconspicuous in dark tracksuits, always on bikes. They never caused me any particular bother, but I'd noticed that no matter how often I'd encountered them, I never saw their faces. It seemed the angle was always off, but it felt like more than that. One uneventful night, I even made a game of it, watching them on every camera I could to catch a glimpse. No avail. They were no different on the platform, playing and interacting with each other, moving around freely, just never turning quite enough for me to see a face. The faceless youth, as lovingly nicknamed them, had always seemed relatively harmless whilst I was working, but crossing the threshold onto the platform and facing the prospect of traveling to the destinations that I'd always found mysterious had left me with a deeply uncomfortable feeling in my gut. Even passengers as innocuous as them seemed more dangerous without my plexiglass fortress and security button, more sinister. I tried Googling some of the stations when I first started, without any real result. The stations that we serve don't appear on any other line in the city, and judging by the passengers that traveled to them, I wasn't sure I'd be entirely welcome. I didn't fit in, and amongst the eccentric customers, my incredible plainness stuck out like a sore thumb. Now approaching Platform 5 is the Village Line service to Accordion Hill. Please stand clear and mind the gap between the train and the platform. My legs wobbled as I got up from the bench and tried to remain steady while the train sped to a stop. My anxiety irritated me. I don't know what I expected, to be eaten by some sort of monster within moments of embarking on my journey. Ridiculous. Thoughts of Irene kept me focused. There were only 2 other passengers in my carriage. An older man, maybe late 40s, sat in the left corner facing the window, and central was a teenage girl. The girl was disheveled looking, washed out, pink hair sticking up in all directions, and dirty, slightly ripped clothes. She had headphones stuck over her ears, creating a gentle rhythmic hum throughout the small space. I hesitated for a moment before settling on a seat. Compared to some of my more eccentric customers, my 2 carriage mates were positively average. That was, until the man let out a gentle growl, helping ease my decision to sit closer to the girl and also to the exit. As the train pulled away, the robotic announcer told us that the first stop would be Monsoon Valley. I sunk into my seat, thinking about the explosive man from my shift the night before. Atlas had laughed about staff at Envy having to deal with him, and being so close we had frequent contact with the guys working there. Despite this, I'd never once wondered what Monsoon Valley looked like. Is that strange? All the customers, the destinations, the incidents, and never a moment of curiosity. I wondered if there was something wrong with me. I watched out the window as the cityscape entered winding fields that I never knew were so nearby. It seemed almost impossible that such vast expanses of natural beauty could be so close to a concrete jungle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the pink-haired girl glance at me on occasion, and I was careful not to make eye contact. The closer we got to Monsoon Valley, the more unbelievable the landscape became. The winding fields became deep valleys between intimidating rolling banks and hills. The sky outside the window, despite it only being early afternoon, was a dusky shade of lavender. The change was sharp, from blue to purple, eliciting an audible gasp that I tried to stifle. Beautiful and otherworldly, a glaring reminder that I was somewhere entirely new. The train slowed as we reached a picturesque village. Smatterings of cottages set in beautiful plots of land with rivers separating them littered the view as we reached a quaint station that sported a hand-carved wooden platform sign. "Welcome to Monsoon Valley, home to the end of the rainbow." I felt my brow furrow as I struggled to conceal my confusion and amazement, pulling my hood further over my head in a pathetic and frankly futile attempt to hide how out of place I felt from my carriage mates. Home to the end of the rainbow? I wish I could say that didn't make me want to step off the train and chase the impossible location it promised. Had it not been for the red body part box in my pocket, I probably would have done just that. It felt as if we sat at that beautiful, quaint little station for an eternity, like the driver was tormenting the valiant explorer inside me, goading me. I was grateful when the doors finally shut that no one new had joined my carriage. Everything I could see of Monsoon Valley was gorgeous, but almost too much so. The idyllic little area had a mysterious feel and not one I particularly liked. I wondered what sort of people might live in a place like that. The next stop will be Blackwater Place, change for the Upstar line. I pondered what the next stop would look like, and more importantly, what Thistle Park was going to bring. Monsoon Valley had surprised me, although I wasn't sure where my expectations had started. I didn't get long to delve too deeply into my thoughts because mere moments after we pulled away from the quaint little station, the pink-haired girl stood up and took a seat directly next to me. "You're not a local, are you?" she asked, a knowing smile in her eyes. I ignored her at first, hoping she would just go back to her seat and stop bothering me, but she was persistent. "Where are you headed? Hey!" She got closer and closer to my face until there were only millimeters between us, revealing crusted makeup and open sores on her own. "Thistle Park," I answered eventually through gritted teeth, giving minimal information in the hope she would at least back away. She didn't. "Ooh, ever been before? I bet you haven't." "How would you know? If you looked that scared at the last place, then you definitely haven't been to Thistle Park. The valley is for suckers chasing the rainbow. A holiday compared to the park." Engaging with the girl terrified me, but not half as much as going into my station blind did. Even if Bestaway Irene was alive and well in Thistle Park, I still had no idea where I was going to start looking. Maybe she could provide some answers. "Are you from there?" I asked nervously. The girl laughed. "No, I'm headed further up the line, but I've spent some time there. A nice, innocent-looking girl like you wants to be careful in a town like that." She licked her dry, cracked lips, picking up bits of what appeared to be day-old red lipstick flakes. I smelled stale cigarettes on her breath, and she scratched at her greasy hair that had flattened under her headphones, now perched on her shoulders. Everything about the girl was repugnant. Still, I couldn't bear to take my eyes away from her for even a single second. I was entranced by her, suddenly completely uninterested in the views outside the window. She was all I saw. "My name is Penny. What's yours?" she asked, deep brown eyes fixed on mine. "It's Amanda," I answered, thinking on my feet and assuming the identity of daytime counterpart me in an attempt to protect myself. It didn't work. "No, it isn't," she frowned. Those 3 words were said with such a seriousness and change in tone that I felt my heart stop for a couple of beats, just like it had when Agnes used my full name with such ease. I was defenseless from the moment the train pulled away, and I was starting to regret my impulsive decision to follow a note on a finger. There's no purpose in lying, is there, Elfida? I felt sick. Who are you, and where the fuck am I? I retorted. I'm Penny. I already told you that. Doesn't matter where you are, but it does matter what you're looking for. And I know what you're looking for. Or maybe I should say who you're looking for? I must have become visibly uncomfortable because Penny smirked before continuing. I'm warm, aren't I? The resemblance is uncanny. I can't believe it took me an entire stop to work it out. You know where Irene is? My sister's name stumped Penny briefly. She genuinely looked dumbstruck for a moment before another smug grin stretched across her face. You have no idea what you're doing, do you? She laughed, throwing her head back in a wicked cackle, flakes of painted skin dancing on her lips. Answer me, please? I remained transfixed on Penny, the background beginning to blacken as I lost all sense of anything but her mocking, disgusting face. I felt a fear and a vulnerability that I wasn't used to and couldn't explain. It's like she put me in a vacuum and replaced all the oxygen with her laughter. It reverberated through my soul, making me feel tiny, powerless, weak. I felt so weak I could barely sit up. I tried to look down at my hands to see if I could move them, but my head was frozen, and she was all I could see. The fear started to get worse, and my chest pounded as I took in short, sharp breaths, desperate for air that she hadn't tainted or weighed down. How are you doing this? Doing what, Elfida? We're just having a conversation. Don't you enjoy my company? I think you need something to calm your nerves. I know, music. Penny grabbed the headphone from around her neck and licked her lips furiously as she placed them on my head. I fought my broken body to stop her, but it was pointless. I was completely paralyzed. The sounds that entered my ears and dug into my mind were horrific. Instead of the gentle humming that I had first noticed stepping into the carriage, the headphones blasted screaming and sounds of excruciating pain into my ears. It was a symphony of distress, torture, a cacophony of pain, and it made every bone, muscle, and organ inside me hurt. I don't know when I started to wail, but I did. That's it. Be part of the music, I read on Penny's lips, glee written all over her face, unable to hear her over the unimaginable screeching. I hadn't felt fear like that before. 1,000 abstract thoughts crossed my mind as I searched for something to distract me from the pain. What if I never even made it to Thistle Park? What if I died here on this train at the hands of a dirty teenage girl? What if Irene was out there and I couldn't save her? The black splotches blocking out the view behind Penny grew, taking over her face as I screamed and pleaded for air, desperate not to die. I felt faint, and the world started to blur. She started to blur. Then a crash. It came from the back of the carriage and was the result of the doors that connected us to the next car smashing, glass raining down on the floor. Penny turned, breaking eye contact and providing me with some minor relief. Paralysis waning, I yanked the headphones off and pelted them at the floor, craving the end of the torment. My vision started to stabilize, and I noticed that the growling man in the corner was turned, facing the two of us as Penny stood, hissing at the newcomers who had burst through the adjoining door. The man had teeth like nothing I'd ever seen before, crowding his mouth and overhanging at sharp points in all directions. I would have usually spent longer inappropriately staring at the man. Even in my line of work, things were uncommon, especially ones as mighty as he was sporting. I didn't get a chance to linger on them, however. I was interrupted. Penny screamed. I tried not to look, hugging my knees to my chest and screwing my eyes up tightly to avoid whatever was terrorizing something as terrifying as she was. Her scream was followed by the sounds of ripping and tearing, whimpers, and then eventually silence. "Are you all right, miss?" a young boy's voice asked, breaking the quiet. Slowly, I opened one eye, noticing spokes and rubber. Penny laid on the floor, no obvious signs of breathing, with what appeared to be tire pattern wounds across her face and chest. The entire aisle was littered with bikes. The faceless youth stood at the angles I expected to see them, hoods up, and turned just enough to conceal any identifying features, all except one. I looked at my nearest rescuer, finally catching a glimpse of his face after all the wondering. I tried to hide my shock as I did, but with what I saw, it was a challenging task. He didn't just have one face, he had 3.